All right, so today we're diving into the core principles of the legendary investor Ray Dalio. But I want you to think of this less like a rigid set of rules and more like a powerful guide for navigating your own life's adventure. It's really a system for making better decisions, for facing reality, even when it hurts, and ultimately for evolving as a person. And it all really starts with this one powerful idea. Dalio's success isn't built on being the guy who knows everything. No, it's built on having a system for what to do when you know nothing. This is really the heart of it, a kind of radical humility. This understanding that what you don't know is way more valuable than what you think you already do.
So what are these principles we're talking about? Well, they're not commandments carved in stone. Think of them more like recipes that Dalio developed over his entire life. He'd make a mistake, he'd really think about it, and then he'd create a principle to help him handle that kind of situation better the next time it popped up.
He has this amazing metaphor for life. He sees it as a river. We're all just being carried forward by the river of time, and it's taking us straight toward these encounters with reality. You can't stop the river, right? And you definitely can't avoid those encounters. The only thing you can actually control is how you choose to deal with them when they arrive.
Okay, so this brings us to the first major pillar of his entire philosophy. If you want to make good decisions, you absolutely have to accept the world as it is, not as you wish it would be. And that means you have to embrace the truth, especially when it's painful.
And believe me, for Dalio, the most painful reality check he ever got came back in 1982. He was so completely convinced that the U.S. economy was about to hit a massive depression that he bet everything on it. I mean, his whole company. Bridgewater. He went on TV, he was super vocal about it, he was all in.
And he was completely, totally wrong. Instead of this epic crash he predicted, the stock market kicked off one of the biggest bull runs in American history. The pain of this mistake wasn't just about the money, it was this deeply humbling, very public demolition of his own ego.
And I mean, the failure was total. He had to let all of his employees go until it was just him. He was so broke that he had to borrow $4,000 from his dad just to cover his family's bills. This was absolute rock bottom. But, and this is the entire point, from that rock bottom moment came the single most important equation in his whole philosophy. He realized that pain is actually a signal. It's a little alarm telling you that something is wrong. And if you can just stop and reflect on that pain objectively, you can learn from it. Pain, when you combine it with reflection, is literally the engine of progress.
So that brings us right to our next section, the 5-step process. This whole idea, that cycle of painful reflection, led Dalio to build a very simple, repeatable process for turning any setback into a chance for personal evolution.
It's basically a continuous loop, right? First, you set a big goal. Inevitably, you're going to hit a problem. Now, instead of giving up, you stop and diagnose the real root cause of that problem. Then you design a plan to get around it, and finally, you execute that plan. The real magic here is that this creates compounding growth. Every single time you finish the loop, you don't just solve a problem, you actually get smarter and stronger, and you end up climbing to higher and higher levels of success.
Which leads perfectly into our third section, our brain's barriers. Look, the 5-step process sounds pretty simple on paper, but Dalio quickly realized that we are almost always our own worst enemies. He found 2 huge obstacles basically hardwired into our brains that just sabotage our decision-making.
Okay, so first up is the ego barrier. This is that part of your brain that hears criticism and immediately feels like it's a personal attack. Your deep down need to be right becomes way more important than your need to find out what's right. And second, you've got the blind spot barrier. This is just the simple fact that you physically cannot see the whole picture by yourself. We're all wired differently, Some of us see the tiny details, others see the big picture. Believing you can see it all is a massive, massive blind spot.
Dalio actually frames these 2 barriers as our potential fatal flaws. Think about it. In those old Greek tragedies, the hero is always brought down by one single unaddressed weakness. He argues that for us, in our own lives, our ego and our blind spots are those exact flaws that can lead to our own tragic outcomes if we don't figure out how to overcome them.
So the big question is, how do you overcome something that's so deeply baked into who you are? Well, that brings us to section 4, the power of disagreement. Dalio discovered a solution that he literally calls his holy grail for making great decisions.
It really boils down to a fundamental shift in your mindset. You have to learn to trade that little ego-driven hit you get from being right for the much deeper, genuine joy of discovering what is right, even if, and especially when, it proves that you are wrong.
He has this fantastic metaphor for this. Trying to make sense of reality using only your own perspective, with all its ego defenses and blind spots, that's like trying to see the world in black and white. You're only getting this limited, kind of flat picture of what's really going on.
But the moment you start actively seeking out smart, thoughtful people who see the world differently and who disagree with you, it's like switching the world to full color. Everything just lights up. You start to see all the risks and opportunities you would have completely missed on your own. And he actually put this into practice. He built what he calls an idea meritocracy. It's a system that's literally designed to make sure the best ideas rise to the top. The process is pretty simple. Get a bunch of independent thinkers, have them work through their disagreements, and find the best possible path forward. It doesn't matter whose idea it was in the first place. And this all brings us to our final and honestly most profound section, the true reward. Because after achieving all this incredible success, Dalio had a realization that he'd been thinking about the meaning of it all completely wrong. He realized that the money, the recognition, the big achievements, all the things we spend our lives chasing, they aren't the real prize. They're just the bait.
That bait is there for one reason, to lure you into the struggle. Because it's the struggle itself, that process of overcoming problems and pushing your limits right alongside people you respect, that's what forces you to evolve. That shared journey is the reward. The goal isn't just to get across the jungle. The goal is to become the kind of person who can.
So at the end of the day, Dalio's principles aren't really about becoming a billionaire. They're about embracing reality and using the inevitable struggles of life as the fuel for your own personal evolution. So the only question left, really, is how will you choose to approach your own?